Last week, Anthropic, so the maker of Claude, fell out with the US government and the Department of War. This was a huge, high-profile fallout. Trump even took to Truth Social to claim that Anthropic and Claude are enemies of peace and the government and huge woke liberals. And all because Claude said no to some really quite terrifying use cases that the army wanted to implement. And then the very same afternoon, OpenAI announced a high-profile partnership with the Department of War. And since then, we've seen OpenAI uninstalls rise by 295%. One-star reviews spike and double day over day. And then despite being banned by the government, Anthropic's Claude was then used to conduct airstrikes against Iran. What a crazy turn of events, and today I'm covering it all. What the actual contracts say and the fine print now. The things that most people don't know about the situation, the specific details that really do matter, and trying to understand the answer to a key question. When technology becomes so powerful, who has the right to decide how to use it? This is In the Loop with Jack Horton. Hope you enjoy the show. So on Thursday evening, on February 27, Sam Altman sent an internal memo to every single employee at OpenAI. So the Wall Street Journal broke the story, and in it, Altman actually said that OpenAI had long believed that AI should not ever be used for mass surveillance or autonomous lethal weapons. And that this is a case where it's important to me, and I quote, this is by Sam Altman, "This is a case where it's important to me that we do the right thing and not the easy thing that looks disingenuous." And less than 24 hours later, OpenAI then signed a deal with the Pentagon and therefore the Department of War to deploy its models in throughout its security operations. So to understand how we got here, I think you need to understand what happened in the days before this agreement. Because Anthropic had been embedded in the Pentagon's system since, June 2024. And it was the first frontier AI model to get there. They got into this partnership via Palantir and AWS and actually got security level clearance at a level 6, which is classified as secret clearance. And by the summer of 2025, they had a contract worth up to $200 million. And Claude was being used by CENTCOM for intelligence assessments, identifying targets, simulating battle scenarios. And it was reportedly used during the capture of the Venezuelan president in January 2026. And, this wasn't a company sitting on the sidelines here being super ethical. Anthropic was already very deep inside the US military establishment, far more than any other AI lab. Now, the dispute that really kicked off publicly and had Trump weighing in, calling Anthropic an enemy of the people, actually was triggered by Palantir. Palantir tried to get Claude, or Anthropic, to agree to what they call an all lawful use standard, meaning that essentially the military could use Claude for anything they wanted that wasn't explicitly illegal. And Anthropic said, yeah, that's absolutely fine, apart from two exceptions that it wouldn't budge on, which was, number one, mass surveillance or mass domestic surveillance of the American people. And number two was fully autonomous weaponry that would take humans completely out of the loop. Everything else, as I said, was completely on the table, all fine. Every other military use case you can think of, just not those two. Now, on Tuesday, the 25th of February, the Defense Secretary of the US government met with the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, at the Pentagon. And essentially, they gave each other a deadline, which was Friday by 5 p.m. We have to have agreed to all lawful use or lose the contract completely. So lose that massive contract with the US government. And that night, the Pentagon sent what it called its last and final offer. So Anthropic's team had reviewed the offer that was given to them. And essentially their conclusion was, and all the lawyers' conclusion was, that there was lots of wording that framed the agreement as a compromise, but ultimately left all the legal loopholes to just do whatever they want anyway. So essentially we had to just disregard all safeguards. And it got that heated that the CEO of Anthropic, Amodei, published his response on the Anthropic website. You can go see that today. His arguments was specific and not ideological. He said, on weapons, current frontier AI models are just not reliably good enough to engage in targets. And deploying them are just going to endanger American fighters and civilians. And on surveillance, he said that there is no federal law that stops AI conducting mass surveillance on millions of people. Like, federal agencies haven't yet caught up with laws to protect people from mass surveillance. Data brokers can legally sell mass data to the US government and then use those models to quite literally conduct huge mass surveillance. And if you think about AI models, what they're fantastic about is turning huge amounts of data into the ability to zone in on particular people, groups of people, or situations. Before AI, think about this, an agency that buys and sells people's data, it was basically like pouring data into a big bucket, and it's really difficult to make sense of that data. Yes, you can use it, and it's really powerful for machine learning models, and there's loads of nefarious, dangerous use cases there. But with AI, that same data becomes an insane surveillance system. You can cross-reference, you can automatically build profiles that flags individuals or tracks any pattern you want across millions and millions of people instantaneously. The technology is what makes that data really, really dangerous. And that's the gap that Anthropic took a stance on. And I have to say, I've been a big Claude user for a long time. I couldn't even imagine using OpenAI. I've not got an OpenAI subscription. I tell everyone to not use OpenAI for a number of reasons. We'll discuss those, I'm sure. But it makes me respect the company a bit more as well, because Amodei wrote, and I quote, "These threats do not change our position. We cannot in good conscience accede to their requests." Anyone that's been an entrepreneur that has their own business or is running high-profile, high-pressure teams, for example, knows that the pressure to say yes to contract can be pretty overwhelming at times, because although a company from the outside looks amazing, there are always, as we all know, internal stresses and pressures. And sometimes doing that right thing is not easy, especially when you're throwing away hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions and probably billions over a couple of years of potential revenue. And he said no, which I'm so relieved at. So yeah, that's all the situation that led up to Donald Trump, and I quote, calling them left-wing nut jobs, putting American lives at risk, and threatened actually the full power of the presidency with major civil and criminal consequences if they didn't agree to cooperate. And a few minutes later, they called Anthropic a complete supply chain risk that must be removed from every system. That same evening, about 8-9 hours before the US launched strikes on Iran, Sam Altman announced on X that OpenAI had reached an agreement with the Pentagon. Surprise, surprise. So yeah, let's get into what OpenAI's agreement looks like. Because as I've said, they're seeing huge backlash right now from their customers and user groups. On the face of it, both companies are claiming identical principles. The difference is the mechanism, and the mechanism is quite literally everything. So Anthropic wanted specific contractual prohibitions. So language in the contract itself that specifically banned surveillance and autonomous weaponry, regardless of their legal status. So whether or not that is made legal in the next 2, 5, 7 years, they did not want AI to be used for that. And obviously that's what the Pentagon refused to accept. Their position was that no private company should ever have veto power over how the military uses technology. The Constitution and existing laws are the appropriate constraints in the view of the Pentagon. And, there's an argument to say that it's, and this is what was on all American news channels, on CBS, saying on some levels you have to trust the military to do the right thing. And the geopolitical argument behind, that stance is real. Like, there are real threats all over the world. And China's AI labs are definitely not negotiating red lines with their government. Their integration is moving incredibly fast because there's zero friction. And so the Pentagon will view this as an arms race with China. And you can't let, from their perspective, the government's perspective and the Pentagon's perspective, the vendors set the rules. Whereas OpenAI have taken a very different approach. Instead of any contractual prohibitions, they cited existing laws and policies. So the Fourth Amendment, the Foreign International Surveillance Act, which is a Pentagon directive against autonomous weaponry. Their position is essentially, these laws already cover all of our concerns. The government has agreed to follow them, and we've built technical safeguards into the model as an additional layer of protection. But this is where, if you read the fine print, where, there's a gap that opens up. So Jessica Tillotman she's the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law at George Washington University. She analyzed the published contract, and she concluded that it doesn't give OpenAI an Anthropic-style ability to stop the government using the technology on those use cases, though it does state that the Pentagon cannot use the technology when breaking laws, which sounds reassuring until you remember that the entire reason Anthropic drew its lines was that no existing laws prohibit the things that we should be worried about, because law has not caught up yet with technology. You know, the 2023 Pentagon directive that was against autonomous weaponry that OpenAI is citing, it doesn't actually ban them. All it is creating guidelines on how it should and should not be used. And there's always a waiver that essentially is a clause stating that urgent military need means that you can do anything you want. And Altman even admitted in an AMA, so it Ask Me Anything on X a couple of days later, that the deal was very, very rushed and that the optics definitely don't look good for OpenAI. And he even went further and said on Monday that we shouldn't have rushed to get this out on Friday. Even OpenAI's own team and people noticed. Leo Gao, an alignment researcher at the company, even said that it's so obvious that this is weak and the government can now just technically use it for anything that is deemed lawful. But there are now missing laws to deem what is or is not lawful when it comes to things like mass surveillance. Now, there is always a counterpart, which is OpenAI has argued that if you don't trust the government to follow the law, why would you trust it to honor contract terms either? If the Pentagon is going to do mass surveillance regardless, aligning Anthropic's contract wouldn't stop them doing it. And there definitely is something to that. However, contract terms shape behavior, and it creates oversight mechanisms and establishes political consequences for actions and violations. A line in the sand that someone might just step over anyway is better than no line in the sand. And anyway, there's been huge fallout, as you can just imagine. The cancel ChatGPT movement it's been going on since January. I actually cancelled mine in January because I found Greg Brockman was the biggest donor to Trump, donating over $25 million to his action committee. And I think the Pentagon situation has turned this into something much, much, much larger. ChatGPT's daily download growth fell by 13%, and one-star reviews spiked over 775% on Saturday, and doubled again on Sunday. Claude downloads climbed by 81% and hit number one on Apple's US App Store, with over 500,000 downloads in a single day. People aren't just debating policy online. I think they're voting with their fingers and their thumbs. So I think there's going to be a bunch of things to watch for here. First, whether the supply chain risk designation, so when the government announced that Claude is a supply chain risk, actually gets fully formalized and isn't just a tweet. So far, it's just a social media post. It's not a legal proceeding. And legal experts called it, basically more political theater than an actual show of force. Second, Claude is still the only model on the Pentagon's classified network. And the Wall Street had reported that it was even used in the Iranian strikes just hours after the ban was announced. The military would have 6 months to swap the model under that directive, but many people have already come out in the military saying it's going to be a huge pain in the ass. And third, what could be described as the chilling effect. So, for example, Google has quietly removed its long-standing ban on AI weaponry development from its AI principles. It did that in February 2025, right before signing an agreement with the Pentagon. And every tech company is probably watching what happens to Anthropic, which is if you step out of line, you'll be burnt. So to conclude, I think there's been a bit of a crazy turn of events. I think there's been one of the most high-profile fallings out between a US company and the US government. But what's really important, I think, is that, I can't help but coming back to the fact that Dario Amodei's favorite book, the one that he used to buy for every single new employee at Anthropic, was the making of the atomic bomb. He wanted people at the company to understand that what they were building could and probably would eventually become so important that the government would want to control it. And that when that moment arrived, the people who built the technology would have to decide whether they got a say in how it was used. And that moment arrived last Thursday. One company said no, another said yes, and the person who wrote the memo about doing the right thing then signed the deal the next day. I think that says a lot about Sam Altman, and it says a lot about OpenAI, and I hope the cancel ChatGPT movement continues. Anyway, that's it. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next week.